It all started with a quiet lake tucked away at the edge of a small town. For years, it was my escape: calm waters, tall pines, and silence that felt like gold in a world that never stops moving. I'd go there to fish, to think, or sometimes just to sit and watch the sun sink behind the hills. That lake wasn't just a piece of land to me, it was part of who I was. But then one day, everything changed, out of nowhere. The Homeowners Association decided they wanted to turn my lake into their playground. They saw it as the perfect spot to build rows of vacation cabins. 79 of them. Almost overnight, bulldozers moved in. Trees were cut down. And the peaceful place I had known for so long started to look like a construction site. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of birds. The smell of sawdust and gasoline filled the air where fresh pine used to linger. At first, I thought maybe I could live with it. Maybe once the cabins were done, things would settle down. But it wasn't just the noise or the traffic. It was the way they treated the lake as if it was theirs to claim, as if it had never belonged to anyone else. They never asked me. They never even thought about what this place meant. To them, it was just a business venture, another way to make money off people looking for a weekend escape. To me, it was home. I tried to reason with them. I tried to explain. But every conversation ended the same way, with someone from the HOA brushing me off, smiling that kind of smile that says they've already made up their mind. And that's when something inside me shifted. I realized I couldn't just sit back and watch as they carved up the lake and turned it into something unrecognizable. See, there was one thing the HOA didn't know. One thing no blueprint or building permit had accounted for. The lake wasn't just a lake, it was held back by an old dam. And I was the only one who truly understood how much power that dam held. So when they finished their 79 cabins, it's all lined up pretty and waiting for vacationers, I made a choice that would change everything. And that's when the real story began. The dam was older than most people realized. It had been built decades ago by my grandfather, back when this land was nothing more than wild woods and open sky. He used to tell me stories about how every stone, every wooden beam was set in place by hand. It wasn't fancy, but it was strong enough to hold the water steady, season after season. Over the years, he taught me how to care for it, how to check the gates, how to read the water levels, how to spot the tiniest cracks before they became a problem. Most people who came to the lake never even noticed the dam, but to me, it was as much a part of the lake's heart as the water itself. The HOA didn't care about that history. They didn't care that my family had kept the lake alive for generations. To them, the cabins were all that mattered: shiny new vacation rentals with promises of profit. They sent out glossy brochures with pictures of families roasting marshmallows by the water, smiling under the glow of porch lights. They were already advertising it as the perfect getaway, the hidden jewel of the county. Every ad felt like a punch to the gut. Neighbors who once waved at me in town started talking about how much money the cabins would bring in, how lucky I was to live right next to such a big project. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the generators running late into the night or watch the dirt run into the lake every time it rained. I saw fish floating lifeless near the shore. I saw the waterline drop where they pulled too much from the spring, and through it all, the dam sat there quiet, steady, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a wall of stone. It was like a secret that only I held, something no one else had bothered to look at closely. They built their dreams on my lake, but they never asked themselves what was holding that dream together. That was their mistake. The cabins stood in neat rows along the shore, like teeth biting into the edge of the lake. Each one had fresh paint, new decks, and shiny glass windows that caught the sunlight. From the outside, it looked perfect, too perfect. People from the HOA walked around with clipboards, checking off boxes and talking about rental rates. They were proud of what they had built, and in their eyes, the lake was nothing more than a backdrop for their business. But to me, every cabin was a reminder of how quickly things had been taken. I remembered when those same spots had been covered with wild grass, where deer came down at dusk to drink. I remembered mornings so still you could hear the splash of a single fish jumping. Now, instead of quiet, the air was filled with laughter from workers, music from radios, and the constant buzz of saws. What they called progress felt more like a slow erasing of everything that made the lake special. I couldn't help but notice how careless they were. Trash left behind near the waterline. Heavy trucks driving too close to the shore. Pipes pushed into the lake without anyone asking what it might do to the balance of the water. They were building quickly, but they weren't thinking about the foundation beneath them. And that foundation was the dam. I'd walk past it at night, running my hand along the cool stone, listening to the deep groan of water pressing against it. Most people wouldn't have given it a second thought, but I knew better. I knew how much strength it took to keep that water still, and how easily it could all change if the balance tipped. The HOA had built their dream community on borrowed ground, and the dam was the one piece of the puzzle they never even saw coming. The first guests started to arrive not long after the cabins were finished. SUVs pulled up the dirt roads, trunks packed with coolers, fishing poles, and inflatable rafts. Families stepped out, stretching their legs, pointing at the water as if they had just discovered it themselves. At night, the glow of porch lights reflected off the surface of the lake, turning the darkness into a blur of yellow and gold. The HOA called it a success. They said the cabins were already booked out for weeks. But as I stood on the far bank, watching the water shimmer, I felt the weight of something pressing down on me. Heavier than the dam itself. Each day, the strain on the lake grew worse. More boats churned the water. More trash floated near the shore. The once clear surface turned murky, cloudy with the runoff from all their activity. I could see the fish swimming deeper, retreating from the noise and the lights. The balance that had held for generations was starting to crack. Just like the old stones of the dam beneath the surface. What the HOA never noticed were the signs. Tiny leaks in places no one but me knew to check. A hairline fracture running along the west wall, hidden behind moss and shadow. I had watched it carefully, measuring it in my mind against the rising pressure of the water. They built their cabins with no thought of what kept the lake standing, and now? Every hammer strike and every added weight only pushed it closer to the edge. Standing there at night. The cabins glowing like lanterns across the water. I felt the tension rising inside me, just like the lake behind the dam. It was only a matter of time before something gave way. And when it did, it wouldn't just be water rushing through those stones. It would be the end of, everything they thought they had built. Just when I thought the tension couldn't rise any higher. The HOA made another move that shifted everything. They weren't satisfied with the cabins alone. At a late-night meeting under string lights and plastic chairs, they announced plans to expand even further marina on the far side of the lake, complete with boat slips, a clubhouse, and paved parking lots. The applause from their members echoed across the water like a challenge, and I knew then that they weren't slowing down. They were just getting started. The marina meant more construction, more machines, more pressure on the lake and the dam that held it all together. But it also meant something else, digging into areas of the shoreline that had been untouched for decades. What they didn't realize was that those areas hid weaknesses, soft earth that shifted with heavy rains. I had seen it happen before, small landslides that sent mud pouring into the water. If they pushed forward with their plans, they weren't just risking the cabins, they were gambling with the entire lake itself. And yet, the HOA brushed off every concern. When one of the workers mentioned that the soil seemed unstable, I overheard the board laughing, saying it was nothing a little concrete couldn't fix. They thought money could solve everything. But money couldn't stop the water from pressing harder against the cracks, or the ground from sliding under too much weight. I started to realize something chilling. It wasn't only the dam that held their dreams in place, it was time. Every day, they ignored the warning signs. Every day, they pushed the lake further than it was meant to go. The closer everything crept toward disaster. The cabins might have been their pride, but the marina was their overreach. And I couldn't shake the feeling that once they broke ground on that project, they would trigger something none of us could ever undo. The first heavy rain of the season came sooner than anyone expected. Dark clouds rolled in over the hills, and by nightfall, the storm was pounding the cabins with sheets of water. Guests huddled on their porches, snapping pictures of lightning striking across the lake, thinking it was just another exciting vacation memory. But I knew better. The rain fed into the springs, and the springs fed into the lake. And all that weight pressed harder and harder against the dam. By midnight, the sound of rushing water was louder than the thunder. I went to the dam, lantern in hand, and saw the cracks glistening under the storm. The stones groaned as if they were alive, straining against the pressure. I knew in that moment that the lake could no longer hold what they had forced upon it. Then it happened. With a roar that shook the ground, the dam gave way. Water exploded through the break, a wall of force that surged down the valley. Cabins that had been built so proudly along the shoreline were swallowed in seconds. Porches splintering, lights winking out as the flood swept through. The dream of the HOA, their perfect little vacation paradise, was erased overnight by the very thing they had ignored, the power of the lake. But as the water raged, something caught my eye. Not all of it flowed away. Behind the collapse, deep beneath the surface, another channel opened, an underground passage I never knew existed. The lake didn't just drain. It shifted, carving a new path through the earth. When the storm cleared, the cabins were gone, but the water hadn't vanished. It had simply moved on, forming a new lake farther down the valley. Their project was destroyed. But the lake itself had found its own way to survive. And as I stood there in the silence after the flood, one thought stayed with me. They had built on my lake. But the lake had never truly belonged to anyone, not even me. It had its own will, its own power. And it had just proven it in the most unexpected way. When the sun rose the next morning, the valley looked nothing like it had before. Where there had once been 17 cabins lined neatly along the water, there was nothing but scattered wood, broken glass, and mud carried down by the flood. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, heavy with silence. The HOA members wandered the ruins in shock. Their clipboards and plans useless now. Their dream washed away overnight. I walked the shoreline slowly, though it wasn't really a shoreline anymore. The old lake was gone, reshaped forever. The new channel had carried the water down into the valley, filling a low basin that spread wide and calm. What stood before me wasn't destruction, it was rebirth. A new lake shimmered under the morning light, untouched by cabins, docks, or engines. Birds circled above it already, as if nature itself had been waiting for the chance to take back what was hers. People asked me later if I felt guilty, if I regretted what happened. But the truth is, it wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about winning or losing against the HOA. It was about balance. The land had been pushed too far, and in the end, the water made its own decision. The dam had simply been the line that couldn't hold anymore. In time, the story of the cabins became a warning. Folks in town whispered about how quickly profit and pride can blind people to the power of the natural world. The HOA disbanded, their plans scattered with the ruins. And the lake, my lake, and now not my lake dash, remained as I stood by the edge of the new water. I realized something simple but unforgettable. You can build your dreams wherever you want. But if you ignore the ground they rest on, nature will always have the final say. If you enjoyed this story and want more intense thrillers and suspenseful adventures, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with friends who love a good mystery. Your support helps me bring you more stories just like this one.